For a quarter of a century, one man has stood behind a pulpit in Houston, Texas, and told millions of people, week after week, that their best days are still ahead of them. He rarely raises his voice. He almost never frowns on camera. He has built an empire out of optimism. But behind that steady smile sits one of the most scrutinized religious careers in modern American history. A story full of financial mysteries, theological firestorms, a hurricane that nearly destroyed his reputation overnight, and a tragedy inside his own church that no amount of positive thinking could soften. This is the real story of Joel Osteen, told through the controversies that have followed him for 25 years and never quite gone away. Joel Scott Osteen was born on March 6, 1963, in Houston, the fourth of 5 children raised by John Osteen and his wife Dodie. To understand Joel, you first have to understand his father, because everything about Lakewood Church begins with him. John Osteen was ordained as a Southern Baptist minister while still a teenager and went on to build serious academic credentials, eventually earning a doctorate from Oral Roberts University. His first marriage ended in divorce while he was pastoring a Baptist church in Baytown, Texas. In 1954, he married Dodie, the woman who would become Joel's mother. The family's defining moment came a few years later, in 1958, when their infant daughter Lisa was born with a condition resembling cerebral palsy. That crisis reshaped John's faith entirely. He described experiencing a profound spiritual renewal in the aftermath, left the Southern Baptist Convention, and embraced a more charismatic style of Christianity. On Mother's Day in 1959, he founded what was first called Lakewood Baptist Church in a converted feed store on the edge of Northeast Houston. 90 people showed up to that first service. Within 2 decades, the congregation had grown past 5,000, and by the late 1980s, it had moved into a newly built 8,000-seat sanctuary. Joel grew up inside that expanding world, but he showed no early interest in following his father onto the stage. He enrolled at Oral Roberts University to study radio and television, dropped out after a single semester, and returned home to work behind the scenes of his father's growing broadcast ministry. For the next 17 years, from 1982 until 1999, Joel Osteen was not a preacher at all. He was a television producer, building Lakewood's production operation and helping turn a local station into a serious broadcasting outfit that carried his father's sermons into dozens of countries. Everyone else in the family took a turn at the pulpit, his mother, his sister, but Joel consistently said no when asked. That changed in January 1999. John Osteen, in failing health, asked his son one more time to preach in his place. Joel initially declined, then called back minutes later and agreed. He delivered his first sermon on January 17, 1999, reportedly wearing a pair of his father's shoes for comfort and confidence, while John listened by phone from his hospital bed. 6 days later, John Osteen died of a heart attack. Joel has spoken since about how strange the timing felt, that he happened to step into the pulpit for the first time in the final week of his father's life. By October of that year, he had been formally installed as Lakewood's senior pastor, with his wife Victoria named co-pastor. What followed was a period of growth that turned a large regional congregation into the biggest church in the United States. Osteen initially tried to preach the way his father had, fiery, forceful, traditional revival-style delivery, and it didn't fit him. He has said that not long after taking over, he felt a clear sense that he needed to stop imitating his father and simply be himself. From that point on, his message shifted decisively toward positivity, personal encouragement, and hope, with far less emphasis on traditional themes like sin and judgment. The congregation outgrew its sanctuary almost immediately. In 2003, the Houston Rockets left the Compaq Center for a new downtown arena, and Lakewood moved in on a long-term lease from the city, pouring tens of millions of dollars into converting the old basketball arena into a 16,800-seat church campus. The renovation was financed substantially through a large loan from Bank of America. The new home opened in the summer of 2005 with a grand opening service that reportedly drew tens of thousands of people, including the sitting governor of Texas. Today, Lakewood runs multiple English and Spanish services each week, with attendance estimates regularly placed between roughly 40,000 and 50,000 people, making it the largest congregation in the country by a wide margin. Years later, in late 2010, the city of Houston sold the arena property to the church outright for a fraction of its value. And in December 2023, Lakewood announced from the stage that it had finally paid off the original construction loan. Alongside the church's physical growth came an even bigger publishing career. Osteen's first book, released in 2004, became a runaway bestseller, sitting atop national bestseller lists for years and eventually selling millions of copies. His follow-up book a few years later reportedly commanded an advance in the multi-million-dollar range, an extraordinary sum for a religious title. Over the following 2 decades, he would publish more than 24 books, several of them reaching #1 on national bestseller lists, and would build a media presence that reportedly reaches tens of millions of people across television, radio, and social platforms in more than 100 countries. In 2005, in a move that became one of the most talked-about details of his public persona, Osteen announced he would stop drawing a salary from the church altogether, choosing instead to support himself through book royalties and speaking engagements. He has described this as a lifelong dream, being able to serve without needing to be paid by the congregation. It is a decision that has been framed both as remarkable generosity and, by critics, as a clever way to distance his enormous personal wealth from direct church funding. And that wealth has never stopped drawing scrutiny. Osteen's personal fortune has frequently been estimated in the tens of millions of dollars, sometimes reported as high as 9 figures. Although fact-checking organizations have repeatedly noted that many of the specific numbers circulating online cannot be traced to verifiable primary sources. What can be documented more reliably is the Osteen's real estate. In 2010, Joel and Victoria purchased a sprawling historic mansion in Houston's exclusive River Oaks neighborhood for roughly $10.5 million, a property that today is estimated to be worth considerably more. Because the property is held through a trust rather than owned directly, the family does not qualify for the standard homestead tax exemption, meaning their annual property tax bill runs into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Because Lakewood is a registered church, it is legally exempt from filing the kind of public financial disclosures that most large nonprofits are required to submit. That exemption has fueled persistent criticism from watchdog groups. One prominent ministry accountability organization has given Lakewood one of the lowest possible scores for financial transparency and donor confidence of any major ministry tracks. Investigative reporting from Houston area outlets has suggested that only a small fraction of the church's roughly $90 million annual budget, reportedly around 1% in the year examined, went toward charitable giving outside the church's own operations. Because there is no legal requirement for the church to open its books, independent verification of exactly where the money goes remains difficult, and the gap between the church's public image of generosity and its actual charitable spending has become a recurring point of criticism. Not every controversy involving the Osteen family started in a church. One of the strangest sagas began on an airplane. In December 2005, Victoria Osteen was flying first class to Colorado when she reportedly became upset over a stain on her armrest and got into a physical altercation with a flight attendant. According to testimony later given in court, the flight attendant said Victoria shoved her against a bathroom door and struck her, an account partially corroborated by a second crew member. The flight was delayed by more than 2 hours, and federal aviation regulators ultimately fined Victoria a few $1,000s for interfering with a crew member. A fine, Joel later said he encouraged his wife to simply pay so the matter could be put behind them. It wasn't. The flight attendant filed a civil lawsuit seeking both an apology and substantial damages, describing lasting psychological and physical harm from the encounter. The case went to trial in Houston in the summer of 2008. Joel took the stand and characterized the whole episode as an unfortunate misunderstanding. The trial featured pointed and occasionally bizarre testimony, including a flight attendant calling Victoria the devil during questioning, and a competing witness who claimed the accuser had made a similar false claim against her years earlier. After a relatively brief deliberation, the jury sided entirely with Victoria Osteen. It should have been a footnote in the family's history. Instead, thanks to the sheer strangeness of the details, it became one of the most widely circulated stories associated with the Osteen name for years afterward. If the airplane lawsuit made Osteen a tabloid curiosity, it was his theology that made him a lightning rod within Christianity itself. Osteen's core message, that God wants people to be happy, successful, and hopeful about their future, has drawn some of the sharpest criticism a mainstream American pastor has faced in decades. A theology professor at Westminster Seminary, California, memorably summarized Osteen's preaching in a nationally televised interview as reducible to little more than the idea that God is nice, you're nice, so be nice, and argued that Osteen handled Scripture the way a fortune cookie writer might, extracting cheerful, feel-good promises while ignoring anything uncomfortable or difficult in the biblical text. He went so far as to call the underlying theology a form of heresy. The pastor of a large California church went even further in one of the most scathing public critiques ever leveled at Osteen, describing him as a kind of pagan religionist whose ministry barely mentions Jesus except to reassure skeptical listeners, all while keeping the audience comfortable rather than challenged. He mocked the title of Osteen's first book directly, arguing that anyone whose best life happens now, in this world, is a person in serious spiritual trouble, and compared Osteen's promises of prosperity to the temptations offered to Christ in the wilderness. A prominent countercult apologist wrote an entire book examining what he called the broader Osteenification of American Christianity, the idea that Osteen had become the most visible face of a trend turning faith into little more than a tool for getting what you want out of life, dressed up with the polish of consumer culture, but stripped of the depth of historic Christian teaching. The single moment that pushed this theological debate into mainstream public consciousness came during a live television interview in the summer of 2005. When directly asked whether people of other faiths were condemned, Osteen gave a notably evasive answer, saying he was careful about judging who would or would not go to heaven and that he simply didn't know. The response spread rapidly and triggered enough backlash that, within days, Osteen posted a public statement clarifying that he did in fact believe salvation came only through Christ, and that he regretted being unclear about something so central to his life's work. Critics were not fully satisfied, particularly after he gave similarly vague answers in a follow-up television appearance not long after. True to form, Osteen never really changed his broader tone in response to any of this criticism. When pressed on national television about the potential dangers of a message built entirely around hope, his answer was essentially to ask what could possibly be wrong with giving people hope in the first place. No controversy did more damage to Osteen's public image in real time than what happened during Hurricane Harvey. When the storm made landfall in August 2017 and dumped record rainfall on Houston, Lakewood Church posted on social media that its building was inaccessible due to flooding and directed displaced residents elsewhere. Almost immediately, people began driving to the church, filming the property, and posting images online that appeared to show a building that was dry and reachable. The question of whether the church had genuinely been flooded or had simply chosen not to open its doors to evacuees exploded across social media within a single day. The backlash was fast and brutal, amplified by commentators pointing out the contrast between Osteen's personal wealth and the 16,000-seat arena sitting seemingly empty during a citywide emergency. Lakewood pushed back, insisting it had never fully closed and released photos showing flooding in its parking structure, noting the building had experienced serious flooding once before in 2001. But by the time the church formally opened its doors to shelter evacuees, 2 days after the initial post, the story had already been written in the public mind. Roughly 300 people ultimately found shelter there, real help delivered late. What made the moment worse for Osteen was the contrast with another Houston business figure who had opened his furniture showrooms to evacuees almost instantly and became a local hero overnight. Osteen, by comparison, became a symbol in a national argument about megachurch wealth and civic responsibility. His media tour in the aftermath, appearances on several major morning shows defending the church's timeline, didn't help matters. At one point, he suggested that if the church had taken in a large number of evacuees and the building had then flooded, it would not have been a good story, a comment many viewers found tone-deaf given the circumstances. He later acknowledged, in hindsight, that he wished the church had moved staff and supplies into the building before the storm even arrived. Days after the storm, in a Sunday sermon, he told the congregation that God knew Houston could handle the hurricane and that people should stop being upset about something they were capable of handling. A line that, for many people already frustrated with the church's response, only deepened the sense that Osteen was out of touch with what the city had just been through. Then there's a story so strange it sounds almost invented, except that it happened. In March 2014, Lakewood Church reported that roughly $600,000, a mix of cash and checks collected over a single weekend of services, had been stolen from the church safe. A reward was offered. No one was ever arrested, and the church eventually collected on its insurance claim for the loss. More than 7 years later, in November 2021, a plumber working on a leaking toilet in one of the church's public restrooms pulled back some tile and insulation and found roughly 500 envelopes stuffed inside the wall, full of cash, checks, and money orders. Houston police later said evidence recovered from the checks connected the discovery directly to the 2014 theft. A church official later offered a theory that whoever stole the money may have tossed it up into the bathroom ceiling space, intending to retrieve it later, only for it to slip down inside the wall, where it became permanently unreachable. By the time it was found, the statute of limitations on the original theft had already expired, so no charges were ever possible. The plumber who discovered it was awarded a reward that, coincidentally, matched almost exactly what the church itself had once put up for information on the theft. It remains one of the odder, unresolved footnotes in the church's history, a genuine mystery with a small-time ending.